Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty fundamental, I'd say, to a lot of philosophical thought, and that is the aesthetic.
Yeah.
And if you're someone who, likes to really dig into those core ideas and explore them thoroughly,
Hmm.
I think you're really going to enjoy this one. We're taking a deep dive into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the concept of the aesthetic.
Absolutely.
And we're going to try to, I don't know, wrap our heads around what this word even means.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those terms that you encounter so frequently.
Right.
And yet I think, if you were to stop and think about, well, what exactly do we mean by aesthetic?
Yeah.
I think it's much less clear.
Yeah. And for you, dear listener, if you like, as we've said, really thorough understanding and appreciating things from multiple angles,
Yeah.
you're going to really love this because this is one of those topics that philosophers have really kind of gone back and forth on over, well, centuries. Yeah.
Yeah.
About what this word even means. And it's not just about art either.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it gets into the nature of judgments, like how we judge things
Mhm.
and the kinds of experiences that we really value.
Right.
And even the idea of value itself.
Yes, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think our goal with this deep dive is really to try to extract those core elements of what this concept is.
Right.
How it's evolved philosophically over time.
Yeah.
So we can give you, a little more clarity, a more nuanced understanding.
Yeah.
And highlight some of the key debates, some of the open questions that, are still very much engaging thinkers today in this space.
Right.
So we'll be looking at its origins, going back to that 18th century interest in, quote, taste,
Okay.
and then looking at various modern interpretations.
Yeah.
And even the skepticism that's emerged more recently about the concept itself.
Okay, so let's start, I guess, at the beginning. Our sources indicate that, this idea of the aesthetic actually grew out of this earlier philosophical interest in taste back in the 18th century. So what happened there? Like, what prompted this shift in focus?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is that the emergence of the theory of taste in the 18th century wasn't just some random occurrence.
Right.
It was very much a response to
Okay.
two other kind of significant intellectual currents of the time, right? So you had rationalism and egoism.
Okay.
And rationalism, particularly as it was being applied to
Yeah.
our understanding of beauty.
Okay.
And egoism, especially with respect to our understanding of virtue.
Okay, so against rationalism, what was the core argument
Yeah.
that the theory of taste was putting forward?
Yeah, so the central idea there was what we might call the immediacy thesis.
Okay.
So rationalism about beauty was the view that we judge something as beautiful based on some process of reasoning.
Yeah.
Right? We're inferring from principles or applying concepts,
Okay.
very much like you might solve a logical problem or,
Yeah.
I don't know, something of that sort.
Right.
I think about those kind of 18th century literary critics who were trying to apply like a mathematical precision to, judging literature, right?
Right, right.
Theory of taste, conversely, argued that judgments of beauty are much more immediate,
Okay.
very much like
Yeah.
our sensory perceptions.
Yeah.
You don't reason your way to seeing, a tree is green.
Right.
You just see the greenness of the tree.
Right.
And the theory of taste, that judgments of beauty are very much like that, right?
Yeah.
We directly sense it.
Okay.
We don't need to reason our way there. So one of the, kind of classic illustrations of this is Jean-Baptiste Dubos,
Okay.
who had this analogy of judging a ragu, which I guess is
Yeah.
like a kind of stew,
Yeah.
where you just kind of taste it
Yeah.
and you just kind of immediately know if it's good.
Right.
It's not like you're like, oh, well, let me analyze the ingredients
Yeah.
and then apply a formula
Right.
and then I'll deduce whether it's good or bad.
Right.
And you see, kind of echoing the sentiment later when he says, I would rather believe all the critics' rules were false
Yeah.
than that my judgment of taste was determined by prior proofs.
Right.
So there's this real emphasis on the immediacy, right? This is not,
It's a feeling,
it's a feeling.
not a logical deduction.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, but then the obvious question is, like appreciating a poem or a play,
Mm-hmm.
that seems like so much more intricate than tasting a ragu.
Yeah.
There's so much cognitive work, understanding the narrative, the characters, the language, all that stuff.
Right.
So how do these theorists of taste kind of address that?
So that's a crucial point. And the response there was to say, well, look, we need to make a distinction between grasping the object,
Yeah.
right? So that's taking in, all of its complexities and nuances.
Yeah.
And actually rendering a judgment on its beauty.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it might be that to understand, a complex work of art requires you to, apply concepts and draw inferences and,
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the act of actually then, having that quote unquote proper sentiment,
Right.
the feeling of the beauty, that was considered immediate.
Okay.
And then the other thing they did was they introduced the idea of an internal sense.
Okay.
So this is
Yeah.
distinct from, our 5 external senses:
Right.
sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste.
Yeah.
And you can kind of think of it as this faculty
Yeah.
that operates based on the information that's been initially processed
Yeah.
by our other mental faculties.
Okay.
So as Reid puts it, to perceive beauty, we must first perceive the object's nature or structure.
Okay.
So you're not saying that understanding is immediate.
Right.
It's just the appreciation itself.
Okay.
So there's that distinction.
Okay. So understanding involves the intellect, but the actual judgment of beauty is this immediate reaction of an internal sense.
All right.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned that this theory of taste
Yeah.
was kind of a corrective to egoism when it comes to thinking about virtue.
Right. Exactly.
So how did that manifest?
So against the Hobbesian view that, what we deem to be virtuous
Yeah.
is just that which serves our self-interest.
Yeah.
These moral sense theorists, people like Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, and Hume,
Yeah.
they advocated for the idea of, quote, disinterested pleasure,
Okay.
right? So when we judge virtue,
Yeah.
we are having a sense of pleasure, right?
Right.
But that pleasure is not rooted in self-interest.
Okay.
Just like our pleasure in beauty is not about, our own personal gain. Our pleasure in a virtuous act
Mm-hmm.
is not just about how it directly benefits us.
Right.
And actually, Hutcheson draws this really nice parallel when he says, if our pleasure in the beautiful can be disinterested, then surely our pleasure in the virtuous can be as well.
Okay.
So there's this kind of move to establish,
Right.
the moral,
Yeah.
not just as grounded in individual benefit.
Okay, interesting. So back then, judging both virtue and beauty
Mm-hmm.
were seen through this lens of taste, right?
Right.
But today, we tend to separate the aesthetic from the moral.
Right.
So how did that kind of divergence come about?
So I think the real pivotal figure here is Kant.
Okay.
So Kant fundamentally reinterprets the disinterest thesis.
Okay.
So for him,
Yep.
a pleasure is considered, quote, interested,
Yeah.
not only if it serves our self-interest in this kind of narrow sense,
Okay.
but more broadly if it relates to our faculty of desire, right?
Okay.
So moral judgments for Kant are inherently interested because they lead to a desire to act, right?
Okay.
To fulfill our duty, you're right.
Yeah.
Whereas aesthetic judgments are disinterested precisely because they don't necessarily compel us to do anything, right? Our obligation with respect to beautiful things seems to end with our aesthetic judgment.
Yeah.
And that's why, he talks about
Yeah.
the judgment of taste as being, quote, merely contemplative.
Right.
So you've got this distinction
Yeah.
between, judgments that motivate action
Yeah.
and those that are purely about
Right.
contemplation.
Yeah, okay, that's a really significant distinction. So Kant kind of draws this line between the moral, which is tied to action and desire,
Right.
and the aesthetic, which is more about this detached contemplation.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this shift is also tied to the change in terminology, right?
Mhm.
From taste to aesthetic.
Yeah. And I think what you see is that while the conceptual understanding is sort of evolving with Kant's reinterpretation of disinterest,
Yeah.
the term aesthetic,
Right.
which comes from the Greek for sensory perception,
Yeah.
provided a corresponding adjective.
Mhm.
So Kant himself used both terms.
Yeah.
But for him, aesthetic had this broader scope.
Okay.
So it included, judgments of taste, but also non-normative
Yeah.
sensory judgments.
Okay.
But the usage of aesthetic that kind of gained widespread traction after Kant was narrower. It basically just served as the adjective form of taste.
Okay.
Right. So you think about, Coleridge, for example.
Yeah.
He kind of wished that he had a more familiar term.
Okay.
But he recognized that, aesthetic was going to be useful
Yeah.
for describing this sort of, convergence of form, feeling, and intellect.
Right.
So he says, the term aesthetic is like a
Yeah.
tolerable substitute for taste, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is just,
Right.
aesthetic judgment, aesthetic emotion, aesthetic quality.
Mhm.
All of those just sounded less cumbersome
Right.
than their taste counterparts.
Right. Yeah.
It's just kind of a flow thing, I guess.
Right. Right. Right.
So I think that's part of the reason
Right.
that shift happened, but I think it reflects this shift in focus
Yeah.
from just a subjective, sense
Right.
to maybe a broader,
Yeah. Okay.
potentially object-related quality.
Okay, so we've traced, the historical roots from this 18th century idea of taste
Right.
with its emphasis on immediacy and disinterest to this more modern conception of the aesthetic, particularly as it was influenced by Kant.
Right.
So what about more recent philosophical thinking? Our source mentions like a development of these ideas,
Right.
but also this growing skepticism toward the very concept of the aesthetic.
Yeah.
So what's going on there?
So a lot of the philosophical thinking that comes after this initial period
Yeah.
really does involve, developing
Yeah.
and refining these, initial ideas
Right.
of immediacy and disinterest. So, I think one example of this is in the realm of what we call aesthetic objects,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So you see the rise and eventual decline of what's known as artistic formalism,
Okay.
right? Which was the view that the artistically relevant properties of a work
Yeah.
are purely formal. They're just those properties
Oh.
accessible through sight or hearing.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And this really aligns both with immediacy, right?
Mhm.
There's no kind of complex reasoning that's required,
Right.
and disinterest,
Yeah.
because formal properties are seen as not having practical utility,
Right.
right? They're just about, the pure experience
Okay.
of the senses,
Okay.
right? So you see this with, Hanslick,
Yeah.
who thought that, music was just, quote, tonally moving forms.
Right. Right.
Or Clive Bell,
Yeah.
very famously, he talks about, the essence of painting lying in, quote, relations and combinations of lines and colors.
Okay.
And then Clement Greenberg, he emphasized, painting's inherent flatness and,
Right.
the materiality of pigment, things like that.
Okay.
So there's this real prioritization
Yeah.
of the direct sensory experience of the artwork.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
But our source mentions Danto's Brillo boxes as kind of a significant challenge to this perspective.
Right.
So what was Danto's argument there?
Yeah. So Dante's argument, which was kind of famously inspired by Warhol's Brillo boxes, which were perceptually almost indistinguishable from ordinary Brillo cartons.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
You look at them and you can't really tell the difference.
Right.
Was that, form alone can't really be what determines what constitutes art or its artistic value.
Right.
So you can have these perceptually indistinguishable objects, but one is considered a work of art
Right.
and the other's not.
Yeah.
Or you can have two works of art that look the same,
Yeah.
but one might be far superior artistically
Yeah.
than the other. Right. So his argument is that you can't just look at the form.
Yeah.
And even, he goes so far as to suggest
Yeah.
that maybe aesthetics itself has certain limits
Okay.
in explaining this distinction.
Right.
Right. So, he's really challenging this idea that it's just about those
Right.
direct sensory properties.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So you've got these, perceptually indistinguishable objects,
Yeah.
but the very concept of art
Right.
somehow plays a role in the aesthetic judgment.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so the pendulum swung away from this strict formalism,
Mm-hmm.
and our source introduces Walton's categories of art
Yes.
as another kind of influential anti-formalist argument.
Right.
So what's the central idea there?
Yeah. So Walton's argument is that
Yeah.
how we perceive the aesthetic properties of a work
Yeah.
is going to depend on the category
Okay.
under which we perceive it.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So he uses this example of, imagine Picasso's Guernica, right?
Yeah.
If we experience it as a painting,
Mm-hmm.
we might have all of these, perceptions of
Yeah.
violence and dynamism and,
Yeah.
all of that.
Yeah.
But imagine if instead of experiencing it as a painting,
Yeah.
we experienced it as a Guernica.
A Guernica.
Right. So a
Yeah.
Guernica,
Yeah.
imagine it's just, like a weird relief map kind of object.
Okay.
Right. So then those aesthetic qualities
That's
would
it.
disappear. Right.
Right.
And we might perceive it as being, cold or lifeless or,
Yeah.
something like that.
Right. Right.
So the point he's making is that
Right.
the aesthetic properties of a work are really going to be
Yeah.
those that we perceive when the work is being perceived under its correct category.
Right.
Right. So you have to be seeing it as
Yeah.
the right kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the next question is, well, how do we determine the correct category?
Right.
Right. So he says, it's things like the artist's intention
Okay.
and the established categories
Right.
that are recognized within a society.
Right.
So there are all these purely perceptual factors
Yeah.
that are influencing
Right.
how we're actually perceiving
Yeah.
the aesthetic properties
Okay.
of the work. So he concludes by saying, we judge paintings and sonatas
Yeah.
on the basis of what we see or hear,
Yeah.
but sensory examination alone
Right.
doesn't tell us how to perceive them correctly.
Okay.
Right. So there's this real emphasis on the role of
Yeah.
context,
Yeah.
conceptual understanding, all of that
Okay.
in shaping our aesthetic experience.
Okay, so that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So you've got this idea that our understanding of the context and intention of the work
Yeah.
really shapes our aesthetic experience.
Right.
This has even been applied to our appreciation of nature, right?
Right. Yeah. So this is where you get people like Alan Carlson,
Okay.
who have argued that Walton's framework can be extended
Okay.
to our appreciation of nature.
Okay.
Right. So, we perceive a Shetland pony as cute
Yeah.
because we categorize it as a type of horse.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
A whale possesses certain aesthetic properties
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
based on its classification as a mammal, not a fish.
Okay.
Right. So for Carlson, the appropriate categories
Yeah.
for natural entities
Yeah.
are determined by their natural history as understood by science.
Right.
Right. So it's not just about,
Right.
the surface appearances.
Right.
There's this deeper kind of scientific
Yeah.
understanding
Yeah.
that's shaping our appreciation.
Okay.
So, that's another way
Yeah. Okay.
in which formalism is being kind of pushed back against.
Right. Right.
Now, of course, this application to nature
Yeah.
has been very controversial.
Right.
Right. So you get people like Budd and
Yeah.
Stecker
Yeah.
raising questions about, well, how do we even determine
Yeah.
the quote-unquote correct
Yeah.
category
Yeah.
for a natural item
Yeah.
when there's no artist's intention
Right.
to guide us?
Right. Yeah.
Right. So does that mean that,
Yeah.
aesthetic judgment about nature
Yeah.
is going to be more subjective
Right.
than aesthetic judgment about art?
Right.
That's a question that, has been debated quite a bit.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on now to aesthetic judgment.
Yeah.
Our source revisits this, 18th century debate about immediacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there's a modern parallel to this in what's called the particulars generalist debate.
Right.
Could you kind of clarify that connection for us?
Yeah, so that 18th century debate, as we were just discussing,
Yeah.
really revolved around whether we judge beauty, right, by applying general principles,
Yeah.
or through this more immediate sense of taste,
Right.
right? And, as we saw, Kant very famously denied
Right.
the existence of these principles,
Yeah.
whereas thinkers like Hutcheson and Hume,
Yeah.
believed that taste did operate according to discoverable general principles.
Okay.
So the modern particularist generalist debate
Yeah.
is touching on similar terrain, but with some, important nuances.
Yeah.
So first of all, it's not always entirely clear
Right.
whether the modern debate
Yeah.
is precisely about the existence of aesthetic principles,
Right.
or rather about, what role they play
Okay.
and how explicit they are
Okay.
in our judgments.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's the further issue,
Yeah.
which is if aesthetic judgment already kind of implies immediacy,
Right.
as some people have argued,
Yeah.
then it becomes kind of strange to be debating, well,
Right.
does this immediate judgment rely on principles?
All right. Right.
Because-
Less immediate.
If it's immediate, how could it rely on principles?
Right.
Right. So our source even raises this interesting question of, what would aesthetic judgment even mean
Yeah.
if we were to sort of strip away this notion of immediacy altogether?
Right. 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 So
Yeah.
it gets complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Right. So how are the particularists and generalists actually framing their arguments?
Right. So on the particularist side, you have people like Eisenberg, Sibley,
Yeah.
in one aspect of his work, and Mothersill.
Okay.
And they're basically arguing against the idea that we're arriving at aesthetic judgments by applying these, pre-established
Yeah.
general principles.
Okay.
Right. So Eisenberg famously said
Yeah.
that there's not a single descriptive statement about a work of art
Okay.
where we would all universally agree beforehand.
Yeah.
If this is true, then I will like it more.
Right.
Right. So he suggests that, when critics point to descriptive features in their analyses,
Yeah.
they're not implicitly appealing to these hidden general principles.
Yeah.
They're really offering what he calls directions for perceiving.
Okay.
Right. They're trying to guide us to experience
Yeah.
the work in a particular way.
Right.
And then you have Sibley in his, really seminal essay, Aesthetic Concepts,
Yeah.
arguing that, applying aesthetic concepts, things
Yeah.
like balanced, tragic,
Yeah.
all of that, it's fundamentally a matter of taste.
Okay.
It's like judging colors or flavors.
Yeah.
You just kind of have to look and see,
Okay.
right? So there's that emphasis on this kind of directness
Right.
of perception.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what's the counter argument from the generalists?
Yeah. So the generalists, people like Beardsley, Dickey, Davies, Bender,
Okay.
they argue that no, there are these general reasons
Okay.
or criteria that we're actually appealing to.
Okay.
Right. So, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
Sibley, in another part of his work,
Yeah.
he points out that, we often appeal to these inherently positive qualities, spread grace or comicality,
Right. Right.
when justifying our judgments.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So to say that a work is good because it is comical,
Yeah.
that seems to make a certain kind of logical sense.
Yeah.
Unlike saying that it's good because it's painted blue.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's this idea
Right.
that there are these underlying criteria, these principles, even if we're not always, consciously articulating them.
Okay.
Now, even Sibley will acknowledge that, we can't have
Right.
foolproof algorithms
Yeah.
to deduce aesthetic qualities from non-aesthetic ones.
Right.
So at some point,
Yeah.
we still need to look and see, right?
Right.
But he does think that there's
Ah.
a role for these general reasons. And then you get, people like Davies and Bender
Yeah.
who actually propose that, critics do argue from principles.
Okay.
But maybe the principles are relativized to a specific artistic genre for Davies. Or maybe they express probabilistic tendencies for Bender.
Okay.